for joining us on the Fun Lectern platform. This is Walter Strickland. I'm here with a guest that we're glad to have here on campus with us. This is Dr. Vince Bantu. He's Assistant Professor of Church History and Black Church Studies at Fuller Theological Seminary. And today he's with us on campus because he's delivering our 6th annual Black History Celebration Luncheon lecture. And so it's good to have you on campus with us.
Oh, it's good to be here.
And so I'm excited because to do this, because when I met you, I was just amped that there was somebody doing such important work in the area that you're doing it. So, but before we jump into that, because we'll end up getting there in just a little bit, tell us like where you grew up and tell us how you came up and just, in just kind of a short form.
Oh yeah, well, I'm originally from St. Louis, born and raised, and it was on the west side too, but I wasn't on the playground most of my days, came up there and I got saved at an early age. I grew up in, with a Christian mother, shared the gospel with me at an early age. And I think I was about maybe 7, 8 years old was the first time that I, can remember I asked the Lord to be my Lord and Savior. And I used to do it I used to do it regularly, until then later on I was like, oh, I think I'm good, but yeah, I remember getting baptized young, and I had a passion for evangelism and sharing the gospel, from a very, I grew up in a, kind of very racially segregated community in St. Louis, kind of grew up traversing all of that. So also had a mind for like issues of culture and identity and division and all that. And so, those have been like big passions since day one.
Definitely. So then you went from growing up like that, then you went to Wheaton for college. So tell me about, so you went to Wheaton, and then tell me where else you went from there, because obviously you ended up getting a PhD. Actually, I know, but you need to tell the people.
Yeah, for sure. So that was actually how I ended up going to college, period, especially, and specifically like a Christian college, because, like I said, I had a passion for evangelism and sharing the gospel from a very young age, man. I used to be in middle school handing out tracts, in the lunch cafeteria, and so, when I was about 16, I felt the Lord call me to ministry. And so my first thought was, I want to go somewhere and study where I can really be more prepared. And I had a lot of questions about the Bible and theology, and a lot of, sometimes people in the context I was growing up with, we didn't have those resources. My family, no one in my family, I went to college. So it was really just providence, man. Somebody one day was like, well, have you heard of this, place called Wheaton? So I was like, oh, okay, I'm gonna go there. So that was the only school I applied to, and, got in by the grace of God. And, went there to study theology and, majored in that as an undergrad. And then, but I wasn't done, I was like, I need some more, and I hadn't heard of seminary before. I mean, we in a seminary right now. I didn't even know what a seminary was. I was like, cemetery, I'm not going there until I'm done, and, but I thought that's what I was doing with seminary, because I had came in with a very sharp focus. I wasn't like, oh, I don't know what I want to do with my life. I was like, no, I'm here. I was like, if in a way I was almost coming into college at 19 on almost like a missionary on furlough. Like I'd already been in ministry for 10 years at 19. And so I was kind of like, all right, I'm gonna take a break and now and just study. And then I heard about seminary. I was like, okay, I'm gonna go do that. And I didn't realize yet that really that was the Lord kind of showing me that he had this academic, kind of intellectual, thing that he had put in me. I just didn't realize it yet. So I ended up going to Gordon Conwell Seminary up in Boston. They have a campus for urban ministry in the inner city in Boston. And that was what drew me to it, was I really wanted something that was a bit more diverse and kind of, really pressing into issues of justice, and urban ministry is a passion of mine. So my wife and I, we did our MDivs there. And then, and it was during that time where I really, that's when the Lord just really revealed to me that this is really what he wanted me to do to serve the church. Especially in that kind of context. That's a big passion of mine, is really providing theological education, especially in under-resourced communities. That's really, I mean, in our community, the African-American community, but even in other spaces as well, that's like my biggest passion. I mean, the seminary I was at, you had, the typical student was somebody who was middle-aged and was maybe bivocational and probably maybe was a not from this country, but an immigrant pastor or something like that. That was the norm. And some maybe didn't even have an undergraduate degree. And I just fell in love with that space and that context, and I really felt called to that. And then on top of that, the way that theological education was being done in a very contextual kind of way that embraced the full body of Christ, that was really, that also really struck me. And in particular, the church history class that I had was actually a trip to Egypt, where, me and some of the students at Gordon Conwell, we all took this trip to Egypt. And that was the first time I had ever heard anything about like the early church in Africa. Like I had never heard anything about it. And I was kind of like feeling some type of way about that, because I was like, I studied theology, and it's not like, why didn't I hear about this? So I just got hooked with that. And I was like, wow, like, I remember, man, like the some of the other students were in tears, and some of I remember especially there was an AME pastor who was from, he was a pastor in Boston, and he was joining us on this study tour, and he was in tears because he was like, he was maybe, I don't know, 60s, 70s. And this wasn't, this was a pastor. He was one of the most prominent AME churches in Boston. And he was in tears because he's like, I had no idea that there were Christians in Africa before slavery. Like I thought our Christian journey began in slavery. And so many of us were like in the same place, and it was powerful, man. So I was like, that I got hooked in. I was like, that's what the Lord wants me to do. I want to teach, and I want to teach that in particular.
Oh, wow.
And so yeah, man, I just ended up doing a THM at Princeton Seminary in church history, and then I ended up going to Catholic University of America in DC, because they have a whole department of Semitic and Egyptian languages, and also Institute of Christian Oriental Research, and that was just, so I dug in there and did my PhD there, and working on like Coptic and Syriac and Ethiopian literature, and that was just a great opportunity to really just kind of just swim in that whole like side of church history that's just so deep and rich.
So it seemed like at Wheaton, and then at Gordon Conwell, and then especially in Boston at the urban campus, and then at Princeton, and then also at Catholic University, there's things that you glean from each place that sort of have formed you, which is I just love that about your own story, and so much of your story resembles my own when I was, finding these voices in the history of the church that were underrepresented in the sort of normal textbooks that you would read for a church history course. And I was just, because I was a year and a half into my MDiv before I discovered these names, these people who had been faithful Christians, because I assumed that, to be an African American, to be Christian, was to be someone who was like, unorthodox. But then I found all these Orthodox folks. I'm like, where have these people been? And so at Fuller, you teach multiple classes, but you teach a class on early Christianity. How does your passion for what you were just talking about earlier, and all those sort of that conversation that you just didn't know about, from your time at Wheaton or your time at, early time at Gordon Conwell, how does your study and your PhD influence how you teach a course on early Christianity that's usually more broad?
Yeah. That's probably my central focus. That's really kind of one of my central values that shapes how I teach, like everything. And especially I love doing early Christianity. Like that's really my thing. Not for academically, but also ministerially, just as a pastor and as an evangelist. Because especially in our community, there's so many people, different groups, and more and more, even Black believers are being confronted with this idea that Christianity is essentially at its core an oppressive, slave endorsing religion, and that's the totality of our experience with it from the origins. And so even just in terms of presenting the gospel, that's one of the top issues that we have to encounter in sharing the gospel, even just on the streets or even in the churches. And so I think for me, like going back to the origins is something that is very valuable to me, and especially with the eye for exploring the cultural richness and diversity of Christianity at its very origins. And so, and even like I'm kind of getting into how it affects me. I'm even getting into a place where I'm increasingly even trying to kind of center African identity, even in theological discourse. So I'm even getting to a point where I'm like, kind of trying to go back and reclaim. So even when I say Christianity, I'm getting to a thing where I'm using this word bisrat, which is an ancient Ethiopic word, which means like the gospel, and just almost as a stand-in for Christianity and all over the place. And I do that in my classes, and so yeah, when it comes to teaching classes on early Christianity, which I think is some of the best places to engage that both this academic theological issue, but also the practical and ministerial issue, is looking at the origins to see like where did this all come from and what was the nature of it. Because oftentimes, like you said, like, and I thought the same way, we think that the Bisrat Christianity just kind of developed in, it went straight from Jerusalem, but then Jerusalem fell and went into Rome and into Europe and then into North America. And then not until modern times did it come into non-Western, non-white people. And honestly, I think many of our seminaries, we still kind of follow that Western mindset where we don't even start talking about global stuff or diverse stuff. I mean, if you notice, even in how curriculum is set up, it's usually in the modern time that we start talking about global. But when we're in, so that's why I love to look at it in ancient context. And so, yeah, I mean, we focus on, the early church in Persia and, the early church in India and in China and in Europe as well, in the Roman Empire, and later in Europe, and then in Africa and Ethiopia and Nubia. I mean, it's Armenia. We make it real broad. And another thing, I mean, there's so many things we could talk about, but I'll just say quickly that, two quick things is that number one is just the geographical spread, that I give everything equal attention. So I don't prize kind of the Greek and Latin church fathers as being more important or kind of central. I think most church historians see the Greek and Latin and then later European church fathers, and then of course the Reformation, European Reformation, because there were reformations in other places as well. But we usually prize that as being the most important, and then we see the non-white stuff as like the add-ons or the stuff we get to later. But I give everything equal attention. And then also, I even try to, the last thing I'll quickly say is I even try to, because as a historian, the way we periodize history is usually according to a Western rubric. Like when we say things like late antiquity, or when we say things like the Dark Ages or the medieval times, or when we cut things off at the European Reformation, and that's our benchmark, that we're kind of doing things in a according to the Western periodization of history, that what was going on in the West should set the standard for Christian theological developments. But I don't do that. I say, well, I kind of just do a regional approach. I say, well, this is a survey of the Church of the Bisrat Christianity in Africa. And in that context, there were totally different periods. I mean, what was the Dark Ages in Europe was actually the golden era of theology and culture in Ethiopia and in Nubia and in the Middle East. And, and so I'm like, well, that's so, yeah, in the Western context, these are the periodizations we're going to use. But in this African context, or when we go into this Asian context, same thing, totally different periodization. And so that's another example of how I'll, instead of approaching church history from like this westernized periodization, I try to just take more of a regional approach where we say, well, let's look at this context and see kind of what were the major benchmarks or turning points in this historical context, which is completely different. Like, things that we might consider to be massively influential things in Western Europe that was going on. It had like almost little to no effect. I'll just give one example and then I'll be quiet. But one example is like, we always look at the Council of Nicaea and 325, right? And the 4th century in general, especially in early Christianity, that's the most pivotal time in church history. And that's almost like that's a benchmark, or that's a dividing line. I'm like, well, I mean, there was an entire, like at that time in the 300s, like half the Christians in the world were in the Persian Empire. And they sent a few delegates to the Council of Nicaea, but they were not wrestling with the question of whether or not Jesus was divine. They were clear on that. That was actually a Roman problem. The Roman church was wondering, well, is Jesus divine, or is he created, or is he, how do we deal with that? Persian church, or the church in India, or in other places, that wasn't a question for them. And so that's not really that's not really, so when you're doing, but when you read church history textbooks, they do it in this kind of totalizing way where they'll say the church, or this is what the church was wrestling with, or this is what was going on in the church. I'm like, well, what you really mean is the Western church. And that's cool, we can talk about that. But that does not mean that is decisive or determinative for places in other contexts that, weren't even aware that these meetings were going on.
Yeah. So I've actually heard a professor at Biola, he was lecturing about the creeds. Mm-hmm. He was like, well, the creeds are a contextual phenomena. Mm-hmm. And my mind was just blown the first time I heard that. I'm like, what do you mean? Like, but that's a Catholic church sort of reality. But he then began to say, well, at the same time, you have to consider that, again, the whole church wasn't there, represented especially proportionally, and they were answering specific questions that were pertinent to a lot of Christians, but it wasn't pertinent to all Christians. And so to see the creeds as contextual does not say that they're not important. It's not to say that they're not giving a helpful witness to the actual sort of the apostolic sort of understanding of and articulation of the gospel, but it's just saying it's answering and sort of combating specific questions that were happening in a specific place. And so my mind was blown, and I was well into my education before I even sort of tuned in. Is Eric Thomas, he was he was saying this. Hopefully I don't get him in trouble for saying that, but the periodization piece is so important because whomever's periodization used usually is seen as primary and everything else is secondary. So I as you were saying that, I was just very encouraged to hear not only that that's the case, because I knew that for myself, but to hear how to then affirm the sort of standard or classical or more prominent periodization, but then also say, here's how you teach that, but also parallel to others in the sense that the regional sort of, I like that. I'm gonna have to jack you on that. But I'll cite you though.
Hey, break me off a little bit. Just take me out to breakfast again.
Yeah. I mean, this is my Bantu on this right here. But you mentioned apologetics early on in that answer. So tell me how you've used your study apologetically, particularly in African American environments.
Yeah, man. I mean, it's amazing how much they overlap because. I mean, when you're engaged, and you know this too. I mean, when you're engaging cats on the streets, like, we have so many different like religious movements in the Black community, and this is just the African American community. But like, I just got back from teaching at a Native American Christian college out in the Southwest, and it's amazing because our brothers and sisters in Christ that are coming from indigenous communities, they're dealing with very similar issues, like, Christianity, that's the white man's religion, and it's the same thing we're dealing with. And I honestly, in my opinion, I think that what my friend and mentor Dr. Subchan Ra calls the Western white captivity of the church, right? The idea that Christianity is inherently a Western white religion, right? And again, we are exacerbating that association when we only tell church history from that Eurocentric standpoint. But what he calls that, right? I would say that is the biggest obstacle or barrier to the gospel in the world, in my personal opinion, because especially you talk about apologetics. Because most of the world is non-white, is non-Western. Most human beings are Black or brown. And in those contexts, people think of Christianity as a Western, white, American, whatever religion. And so becoming a Christian, or a Nazrawi, as I like to call it, that's the Ethiopian word for it, that is seen as tantamount to becoming a Western white American person and adopting it in those forms. And so that creates a tension, a cultural tension. It creates a false choice of, do I have to, people think I have to choose between my identity as a whatever, Native American, Chinese, Nigerian, African American, Incan, whatever. Do I be that, or do I become a Christian? And of course, that's not a choice we have to make, because God created us this way. But that's the association people have in their minds. And so, and with understandable reason. And so, I would say that is the biggest. This is my passion, because that's both, and is an overlap as a scholar and as a pastor and as an evangelist. because there's a deep overlap to it. Because when you're talking to people on the streets, they're not going to engage you many times on the Bible and on what the Bible says or on the gospel message, but they're dealing with historical Christianity. They're going to talk about the Council of Nicaea. Or they're going to talk about Constantine. Or they want to talk about Greco-Roman culture. They want to talk about history. And a lot of times we in the church, we want to go to present the gospel as it's presented in the Word, but there's a big old wall in the way between them and the gospel message because of the way that it's been presented in this kind of Eurocentric form. And so we have to destabilize that first. So we have to get into church history, because you got people, around. I mean, just as one example, again, talking about the Council of Nicaea. There's so many people in our community, whether it's Hebrew Israelites, 5%ers, Kemetic, Nation Islam, Moorish Science, all these different groups that will all be radically theologically different and distinct and not agree with each other. But one thing that they all do agree on is that Christianity is the white man's religion, and that most of us who are Christians, who are black, are we're on the plantation, we're brainwashed, we're assimilated, whatever. And so, and they all will say things like, Christianity and the core doctrines of Christianity, that Jesus was God and divine, that was all invented by the Roman Empire as a mechanism of subjugation, which is of course historically ridiculous and unsubstantiable, but that's where we have to engage, is talking about history. They don't want to talk about the Bible, they want to talk about the 4th century. And a lot of times those of us in the church are not equipped or able to do that, or to really answer those kind of questions. So that's really where I try to equip and talk about church history, and talk about the 4th century, and talk about what was going on. Even what we were saying earlier, to be able to tell people like that, folks on the block, that, okay, yes, the Roman Church held a council at Nicaea because the Roman Church was confused as to whether or not Jesus was a created being or not. But guess what? The Persian Church had their own councils. They had the Council of Seleucia Ctesiphon even before the Council of Nicaea. And they were clear on the fact that Jesus is fully divine and fully God. And they were actually at war with the Roman Empire. These were their political rivals. So that makes that claim then historically unsubstantiable, to say that it was invented at a time when people in modern day Iran and Iraq and Afghanistan were already worshiping Jesus Christ as God, as Lord and Savior, and they were clear on. They didn't need a council to define that; they were already clear on it. And their council happened before the Council of Nicaea, before it was so-called decided. Anyway, but that's just one example of how they all these ministerial and academic things just overlap. Because a lot of these people on the block they're reading up history badly, but they're reading history.
So just to kind of bring into some sort of a summary what you just said, which is a lot and good, and people should rewind what he just said like 4 or 5 times so you actually get what he's trying to tell you. But so in the apologetics class that I had, it was making arguments for the existence of God.
Right.
It was making arguments for theodicy, like the problem of evil, which is those are real questions. Does God exist? How does so much evil happen with the sovereign God? But what you're saying is that sort of a philosophical sort of argument, about just with all that, that's not apologetics as it needs to emerge in these African American contexts, because it's a more of a historically oriented discussion based upon okay, whose religion is Christianity, and then at that point we're able to then say okay. Because we're breaking down these walls for them to hear the gospel, then we can actually get to the Bible. My fear is that people were going to say, oh yeah, there's this wall, so you have to argue historically before you get to the Bible. My fear is that people are going to hear you and say, oh, he's saying that we don't have to read the Bible.
Oh no.
But you're saying that we do have to read the Bible
every day.
But we're trying to get the people that we're talking to hear the Bible on its own terms.
Exactly.
Which is exactly what the sort of like proving the existence of a God who is able to write the Bible is doing in my own apologetics class that I had. So, because the conversation in the black community is not, is there a God, but who is this God? And does he care about what's going on in our communities? And of course, the God of the Bible does. And so that's good, man. So, so tell me how this, like your study and everything, influences your own personal faith.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, like that's, it kind of overlapping with, what we were just talking about. Like, I think a lot of these people who I really have a passion for, because I mean, I agree with everything you said. I mean, like, in the Black community, and Cone, talks about this in his early work too, where, again, a lot of the questions of the dominant theological discourse are not the questions of, the Black community or other communities as well. And while, I would push back on a lot of things there. I think that there's a helpful point there. And the same thing with apologetics, right? I mean, many in the dominant, white culture, most apologetics, they're assuming that the apologetical issues in that dominant culture are going to be the issues in but like you pointed out, most people in the Black community and most communities around the world believe in God and believe in a higher power or the divine, so that's not the issue. But exactly, you got to meet people where they're at, and to engage, and so we can lead them to the gospel and to the scriptures and to Jesus, so I relate to that because I really struggled myself as a student coming up in kind of the world of theological academia, not seeing myself reflected, not seeing my community reflected. And again, like I said, when I first encountered stuff, I was kind of like, what? Like, it was very liberating and exciting. At the same time, it was kind of frustrating because, like, how come nobody told? So I'm trying to kind of, hopefully be a part of the solution by, introducing seminary students to the stuff in the classroom. And because for me, I mean, even just in my own faith, like, it's very empowering to be able to, even when I do things like using ancient, I mean, you know this as a scholar, when you come into the world of seminary, you get kind of inundated with various foreign European terms, whether they're Greek or Latin or French or German. You just get into, so I've just gotten into this thing lately where I just use terms like Bisrat or Nazrawi, and I'm drawing upon ancient Egyptian and Nubian and Ethiopian terms for theological discourse. I mean, another thing I do is like I'm getting into the thing that when I pray, I don't address the Creator, the Elohim, Yahweh, our Lord and Savior. I don't address him as God. I mean, I do sometimes. I don't have a problem with the word God, but if we look at the etymology of the word God, it comes from pagan, pre-Christian, European religious practice, and then got brought into European Christianity, right? But I mean, Gudan or Odin, as he's known in Norse mythology, actually was a pagan word. And so I'm in this thing now. Whenever I'm just having devotions and I'm in the Word, and oftentimes I'll refer to the Creator as Nuda, and because in the Egyptian language, Nuda, when you read Coptic text, like the translation of the Bible in Coptic, which was one of the first translations ever done, even before Latin, is it's just the word for God is Nuda. And so I've gotten into this thing now where I refer to the Creator as Nuda when I'm talking about God or talking to God. I'll refer to God as Nuda and say, and just as a way of connecting, kind of in the same way that I see kind of Egyptian as like the language of it and the civilization of it, and the way that the gospel or the Bisrat was so foundational in that context. And we know this, like whether it's in the diaspora on the continent, Egypt serves as like a foundational civilization for all African people. And we have a common descent and lineage to the Nile Valley civilizations. And so to kind of harken back to Egyptian Christian terms, biblical terms in that language is, I would say, akin to whether it's in the medical field, the legal field, or the theological field, people hearkening back to Latin and kind of using Latin in their parlance. So that's just like one example, but it's just overall umbrella is like, for me, just being able to connect with our African roots is something that I think, and I don't want to get too much into it because I know we're short on time, but the Bisrat, the gospel, was spreading across Africa from a very early stage in North Africa and Egypt and Nubia and Ethiopia, and there's even indications that it was going into Central Africa as well. So the Bisrat was on its way from African to African, and it was on its way into the shores of Eastern and Southern Africa. But through a longer story we don't have time to go through, through human sin and intervention, that process was interrupted, and then our ancestry's first connection to Christianity on the coasts of Africa was through slavery and colonialism. Now, 500 years later, we're trying to kind of undo and disentangle those things. And so, for me, spiritually, it's been a really deep journey of reconnecting to those ancient roots of the Bisrat that were already spreading their way across the entire continent of Africa. And it's an example of owning worship and hymenot or theology in a way that's unique and is for our people, but ultimately that's aimed at, again, glorifying Yeshua.
Man, that's rich. Thank you for that. I'm going to ask you to provide maybe 2 or 3 resources for folks to sort of jump into more what you're talking about, feel free to say that you're writing them or you're working on them, so they can, peep it when it comes out. But man, to just hear you speak about this, I think is going to be very helpful for people, not only who are, in a Black context, but people who hope to minister to Black people one day. They'll understand what the tensions are and how they're unique to their own environment. And so this is really a conversation that is meant to encourage, but also equip people to minister the gospel wherever the Lord might place them. And here you talking about God as creator. That's I love that language because it's a very personal reality, connecting the God to all that we see around us, the provision, and being one who has a design and it's intended to a certain end, and that's really emerging out of the context from which you're talking about early Christianity. I heard that, and then also just a quick note, and then we can close before after you get the books. You mentioned the continent. Interestingly, because I did my PhD at Aberdeen in Scotland. When people talk about the continent, they're talking about Europe. But when you talk about the continent, you're talking about Africa. So anyway, that's just kind of funny to hear, like the perspectival reality when people talk about the continent. And so all that to say. So a couple of resources or books to help folks to dig in deeper. What do you say?
Yeah, I mean, well, I'll take the invitation. I'll plug a little bit.
Well, and the reason why people should know that he might be referencing his own resources. He's not trying to feed his own kids, although that's helpful. But he's doing unique work. And so there you go.
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, hopefully it'll be, helpful in this regard. But there's a book coming out that, my first one, it's called A Multitude of All Peoples with InterVarsity Press. And it's really just kind of just an intro, kind of for pastors or leaders or, students or even, faculty or other scholars that aren't specializing in this, and just kind of get a general feel of it. So that'll be coming out this spring, actually, a couple months. So, but there's, I think there's other good ones that are already out. One that comes to mind is the law. I hate this title, but the Lost History of Christianity by Philip Jenkins. Terrible title, but great book because the history ain't lost. It's very much there. But still a great resource for people to look at, and also that's already out. That gives a great history. And then also. The other thing I mentioned and just asked for prayer for, and we were talking before about how you're working on a reader project, and that's really exciting to me because I also just signed a contract with University of California Press to do a reader as well of ancient Christian texts from Africa and Asia in English translation, and so that'll be a little ways off, but that'll be coming out soon. So to be on the lookout for that, and then also I just give a plug as well for I mentioned the work I do at Fuller Seminary, but also I also direct an African American seminary program called the Meacham School of Hymenot, and so I would say that's another great resource where we offer classes in languages and on history in this particular area. We're actually offering a trip to Ethiopia in January, and so place that people, context people can go, and we have a theological conference coming up in October in Chicago at UMI. So that's all on our website, meachum.org, and so that'd be another resource I throw out there.
Oh man, that's good. So take all that, read, scour, understand that this is a man who loves the gospel, loves to proclaim Christ, make much of him, doing so in areas where the gospel is being contested in unique ways. And he's trying to offer an apologetic, really, for, the Creator. So thanks for joining us. This is Walter Strickland, Dr. Vince Bantu here at Southeastern Seminary from the Lectern media platform. For more information about Southeastern Seminary, College of Southeastern, you can go to sebts.edu for more information. And to follow Kingdom Diversity, you can go to Twitter and go to K_diversity. Grace and peace.